The depot at Cheyenne smelled the way it always did in early March. Coal smoke and frozen mud, and the kind of impatience that collects in places where people are always waiting to be somewhere else. Ruth Pickett stood on the platform with her hands folded over her coat and watched the locomotive slow. She was 58 years old and had no patience for cold, no patience for crowds, and increasingly, no patience for Corbett Shaw, who had asked her to come here this morning with the tone of a man requesting a small favor, when what he was actually requesting was that she manage something he didn't know how to manage himself. He'd handed her a piece of paper at breakfast. Ilara Voss. Black hair, gray eyes, 24 years old, arrives on the 7:10 from St. Louis. He'd said it the way a man reads a bill of sale. Ruth had taken the paper, folded it into her coat pocket, and not said a word. Because she had known Corbett Shaw for 14 years, and she understood the difference between what he said and what he meant. And what he meant this morning was, I can't do this part. The train exhaled a long breath of steam. Passengers began to move, men in wool coats carrying leather bags, a family with 3 children and too much luggage, a pair of cattlemen who smelled like they'd ridden in the stock car with their animals. Ruth held her position near the end of the platform and watched the doors. The woman came out last, not because she was slow. Ruth noticed that immediately. She came out last because there was an elderly woman in the doorway ahead of her, struggling with a heavy bag. And Ilara Voss had stopped to lift the bag down the steps before continuing on herself. A small thing. The kind of small thing that most people perform when they know they're being watched and don't bother with when they aren't. But there was no one watching her do it. Ruth was watching, but the woman didn't know that yet. She stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment, not lost assessing. There was a difference. Her coat was good wool, but worn at the elbows. Her hair was dark and pinned back without ceremony. No curls, no decoration. The hair of a woman who had made a decision about how much time she was willing to spend on her hair, and had stuck to it. She was younger than Ruth had expected, though she'd been told the age. 24 had a way of looking younger in a person's imagination than it did in the flesh, and this woman looked exactly 24. In a way that suggested she had not had an easy 24 years. Their eyes found each other, the way eyes do when one person is looking for someone, and the other person knows they're the one being looked for. Ruth walked over. Miss Voss. Yes. Not yes, that's me, not hello. Not any of the warm connective tissue people usually insert between a greeting and a confirmation. Just yes. Ruth absorbed this. I'm Ruth Pickett. I manage the house for Corbett Shaw. He asked me to collect you. The woman Ilara Voss looked at her with gray eyes that were the color of winter sky, the kind of gray that has no warmth in it, but isn't cold either. Neutral. Taking in information. He couldn't come himself, she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation either. It was an observation delivered without judgment, which somehow made it more pointed than either. He had work, Ruth said. Ilara Voss picked up her bag. It was a single bag and not a large one. Ruth had been expecting at least a trunk. Is that all? Ruth asked. That's all. They walked to the wagon. Ruth waited until they were out of the noise of the depot and moving through town before she spoke again. And then she kept it light. The drive, the road conditions, the unreliability of March weather in Wyoming. Ilara Voss answered when she was spoken to and didn't fill the silence in between, which Ruth found she didn't mind. She'd spent too many years around people who couldn't tolerate quiet to be bothered by someone who could. They were on the open road south of town, the plains opening up around them the way they always did when you left Cheyenne. The sky becoming enormous and indifferent when Ruth asked the question she'd been carrying since she left the ranch that morning. "Do you have family in St. Louis?" The pause was small. A second, maybe less, but Ruth had lived long enough to know that a pause like that in response to a question like that contained something. "Not anymore," Ilara said. Ruth did not ask what she meant. She turned her eyes back to the road and let the words settle into the cold air between them, where they stayed for the rest of the drive. The Shaw Ranch sat in a shallow valley about 12 miles south of Cheyenne, protected on the north and west by a long ridge of weathered sandstone that turned amber in the afternoon light. It was not the kind of place that announced itself. The main house was solid and unpretentious, built from timber and stone by Corbett's father 30 years ago, with the understanding that the Wyoming wind would test anything that tried to be decorative. The barn was larger than the house. The corral was well maintained. The fences ran straight. It was the kind of place that told you something true about the person who lived there. That he valued function over appearance. That he was not sentimental about comfort, that he had thought about what mattered and organized his life around those things. Ruth watched Ilara take it in as they came down the road toward the house. She watched the woman's face the way she'd been watching it since the depot, not intrusively, just carefully. The way you watch the sky when you're trying to read the weather. Ilara looked at the barn first, then the corral, then the fence lines, then the house. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand, not the way a person looks at something they're hoping to love. Corbett Shaw was not on the porch. He was at the fence line to the west post hole digger in hand, working on a section that Ruth had told him last week could wait until spring. He was not a man who ran out of work to do when he wanted to avoid something. He was a man who found work that had been waiting and did it at precisely the time when doing it was most convenient as an excuse. Ruth brought the wagon to a stop in the yard. They waited. Corbett set down the post hole digger. He took off his gloves. He tucked them into his coat pocket. He walked across the yard toward them, and Ruth watched him the way she'd watched him for 14 years. This deliberate, careful man who moved through the world like someone who had learned to measure his steps after once moving too fast and paying for it. He was 38 years old, and he looked it honestly, not old, not worn down, but seasoned. The kind of face that hadn't been protected from weather or difficulty and showed both without apology. His hands, when he reached up to help with the bags, were large and scarred, the left one bearing a long white ridge of scar tissue along the palm from an accident with a rope and a frightened horse when he was 22. He looked at Ilara Voss the way he looked at most things, directly and without expression, taking stock. She looked back at him the same way. Ruth had the peculiar sensation of watching two people recognize something in each other that neither of them would have been able to name. "Miss Voss, he said. "Mr. Shaw." He reached for her bag. She let him take it without the reflexive protest that some women would have offered. "Ruth will show you the house," he said. "I'll be done with the fence by midday." He walked back toward the west fence. Alara watched him go for a moment, not with disappointment, Ruth noticed, but with the look of a person revising an initial calculation. Then she turned and followed Ruth into the house. Inside the house was clean and spare. Corbett Shaw had not redecorated since his wife left 6 years ago, which meant there were no curtains, no rugs, no particular softness anywhere, except the kitchen, which had always been Ruth's domain and showed it. The walls were unadorned except for a few nails driven in at various points from which nothing hung. Ruth had been looking at those empty nails for 6 years. She showed Alara through the kitchen. The sitting room, the hall, and then the bedroom at the end of the hall, the larger of the two with a window that faced south and caught the afternoon light. "This will be your room," Ruth said. Alara stood in the doorway and looked at the empty nails on the wall. There were 3 of them at intervals that suggested there had once been things there. A mirror, perhaps, or a few small pictures. "What was here?" she asked. Ruth considered how to answer. "Things that left," she said finally. Alara turned from the nails and set her bag on the bed. She didn't pursue it. Ruth appreciated that. Dinner that first night was the 3 of them at a table built for 6, which was its own kind of comment on the situation. Ruth cooked. Corbett came in from the field, washed his hands at the pump outside, and sat at the head of the table, with the methodical ease of a man who had eaten thousands of meals alone at that spot, and was not sure what to do with the alteration in the room's geometry. After Ruth set the food and sat down herself, Corbett reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table beside Alara's plate. She looked at it, looked at him. "Go ahead," he said. She unfolded it. Ruth pretended to be interested in her dinner. It was the mail-order bride contract, the standard form Ruth knew, because she'd seen it when it came in the post 3 months ago. But along the left margin in Corbett's handwriting, which was large and even and entirely without flourish, he had written a series of lines that were not part of any standard form. Alara read. Her expression did not change much, but her stillness deepened the way water stills just before something surfaces in it. She set the paper down. "You want a real marriage," she said, not a question. "I want to be straight with you," Corbett said. "I'm not interested in an arrangement that suits us on paper and leaves us strangers in the same house. I've had enough of that. If you're going to be here, I'd rather we be honest with each other about what we're doing and what we intend." "And what do you intend?" He was quiet for a moment. When Corbett Shaw was quiet, Ruth had learned it meant he was choosing words and not just reaching for them. "To treat you fairly," he said. "To give this a real chance. To not pretend we're something we're not, but to see if we can become it." Alara looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen he had left beside the paper he had thought to leave a pen, which told Ruth something and signed her name below the printed lines. "There's something you should know," Alara said. She didn't look up from the table when she said it. "I came here because I needed to leave St. Louis. There's a man there, a creditor, a man my father owed money to. When my father died, the debt didn't die with him. And this man has a particular idea about how I might work it off." She set the pen down, looked up. I'm not telling you this because I owe you an explanation. I'm telling you because you asked for honesty, and I decided to take you at your word." Corbett held her gaze for a moment. "I appreciate that. You're not going to ask me more about it." "Not tonight," he said. "You've had a long day. There'll be time." Ruth stared at her plate and said nothing and thought, this is either going to be the strangest story I've ever watched unfold, or the most obvious one. She suspected both. The first week passed the way first weeks often do in places defined by work in the concrete rhythms of tasks that don't adjust themselves to human uncertainty. The animals needed feeding at the same hour, regardless of what was being figured out inside the house. The ice needed breaking from the water troughs every morning. The firewood needed splitting. The fences kept needing attention. Ilara Voss moved through all of it with the wariness of a person navigating unfamiliar terrain, careful, observant, not yet sure which ground would hold. She had not grown up on a farm. This was evident from the start, and she did not pretend otherwise. On her third morning, Ruth watched her approach one of the dairy cows in the barn, a large, patient animal named without much creativity by Owen Shaw Corbett's late brother, who had called her simply Bess. Ilara stood at a respectful distance and regarded Bess with an expression of mutual uncertainty. Bess regarded her back. Silas Morrow came around the corner of the barn at that moment carrying a feed bucket. He was 45, lean, and weathered, a man who had worked the Shaw Ranch for 11 years and had strong opinions about most things and expressed approximately none of them. He set the feed bucket down, leaned against the barn wall, and watched. Ilara reached out a hand toward the cow. Bess turned her head away with the particular dignity of an animal that has decided a person is not worth further investigation. "She doesn't bite," Silas said. "She just judges." Ilara glanced at him. "I'm not worried about being bitten." "What are you worried about?" She considered this seriously, which Silas clearly had not expected. "Getting this wrong in front of someone who already thinks I'll get it wrong." There was a pause. Silas picked up his feed bucket. "She responds better if you don't reach for her," he said, moving past. "Let her come to you." It was the most Silas Morrow had said to the new woman since she arrived, and Ruth, who had been watching from the barn door, marked it in her mental ledger without comment. In the evenings, Corbett Shaw read. He had a shelf of books in the sitting room, law books mostly, and a few histories, and one battered collection of poetry that he had never in 14 years admitted to owning, but that showed the wear of something read and returned to. After dinner, he would sit near the lamp and read for an hour before sleeping. Ilara Ruth discovered also read. On her fourth evening, she came downstairs with a book from her bag, a small thing with a cracked spine German text, and settled into the other chair without asking whether it was permitted. Corbett looked up when she came in, said nothing, returned to his book. After about 20 minutes without looking up from her own page, Ilara said, "You have Blackstone." Corbett looked at his shelf. "My father's. He believed a man ought to understand the law he lived under." Did he? He understood enough to know when he was being cheated. He paused. "I've been trying to get a bit further than he did." Ilara set down her own book. "How far have you gotten?" He considered. "Far enough to know when a contract has a weak point. Not always far enough to know what to do about it." It was more than he'd said about his own inner life since she arrived. Ruth, passing through the hall, slowed her steps. "My father printed legal notices," Elara said. "Death notices, property transfers, court filings, contract disputes. I set the type for all of it from the time I was 9 years old. You read words long enough, you start to understand what they're actually saying." Corbett closed his book. "Is that how you found work in St. Louis after he died? He taught me to read documents. Other men didn't see the value in that. This man, Finch, only saw what I was." She said it flatly, without heat, the way you say a thing you've already finished being angry about. But Ruth in the hallway heard something underneath the flatness that the flatness was trying to hold down. Corbett said nothing for a moment. "Is that enough for tonight?" he asked. Elara picked up her book. "Yes," she said. "That's enough." On the 7th day, Harlan Creed came to the ranch. Ruth saw him from the kitchen window. 3 riders on the road from the north, Creed in front. On his gray horse, 2 men behind him whose coats were cut. The way men's coats are cut, when the coats are doing some of the work of establishing who the man is. Creed himself was 52, tall in the saddle, with a face that had been handsome once, and had curdled into something that looked like authority at a distance, and revealed itself as something else up close. Ruth dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. Elara was already at the window. "Who is that?" she asked. "Harlan Creed," Ruth said. "He owns the bank in town. He has an interest in this property." Elara looked at her. What kind of interest? Ruth watched Corbett come out of the barn he'd herd the horses he always did, and stand at the corner of the corral with his arms at his sides and his face closed. "Owen Shaw, Corbett's brother," Ruth said. "He borrowed money from Creed's bank 14 months ago to expand the north pasture. The contract had terms. Owen died before he could meet them." "What terms?" "If the debt goes unpaid, and there's no legal heir who can assume it, the land reverts to the bank. All of it. Owen's land and whatever Creed can argue is collateral." Elara turned back to the window and watched Creed dismount and approach Corbett with the ease of a man accustomed to making other men uncomfortable on their own property. She watched the conversation without being able to hear it. Ruth watched her watch it. Watched the gray eyes moving between Creed's gestures and Corbett's stillness. Reading it the way she'd described reading legal notices as a girl. Taking in the shape of it before she could hear the words. Creed smiled often during the conversation. Corbett did not smile at all. At one point, Creed laughed a large social laugh that carried across the yard, and Corbett said something brief in response that stopped the laugh. After perhaps 10 minutes, Creed remounted and rode away with his men still smiling the smile of a man who has made his point and doesn't need to belabor it. Corbett stood in the yard after they left and looked at the road where the riders had been. He stood there long enough for the cold to matter. Then he came inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He had the look of a man carrying something heavy by an awkward grip, not broken, not even close to it, but aware of the weight in a way he couldn't quite set down. Elara placed a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She waited. After a while, he looked up. "Owen signed a contract he didn't read carefully enough," he said. 18 months. 4 months left. I'm short $6,000. And the land. 2,400 acres. His father's fields and his own work for 15 years. He stopped, looked at the table. There's a family cemetery in the northeast corner. My father's buried there. Owen, too, as of December. Ilara was quiet for a moment. May I see the contract? He looked at her. The question had surprised him. He hadn't expected it, and she could see that. And she waited while he recalibrated to it. Why? Because I'd like to read it, she said. I know what I'm looking for. I may not find anything, but I'd like to look. He studied her for a long moment, in the way he studied most things, not suspiciously, but seriously. The way you look at something you're not sure how to categorize yet. Then he got up, went to the desk in the sitting room, and returned with a folded sheaf of papers. He set them in front of her. She picked them up and began to read. Ruth at the counter kept herself very busy with something that required no attention at all. The wedding took place 3 weeks after Ilara Voss arrived on the 7:10 from St. Louis. There was no ceremony to speak of, no guests, no flowers, nothing that would have been recognizable to anyone's idea of the occasion, except for the justice of the peace, a man named Harold Greer who drove out from town and performed his duties with the brisk efficiency of a man who had married a great many couples and was interested in none of their particular circumstances. Ruth Pickett was one witness. Deputy Nolan Baird was the other. Baird was 31, lean and blond with the careful eyes of a young man who had seen enough of Larimer County to know which direction the wind usually blew, and had made a private decision not to blow with it. He'd known Corbett for 4 years since he'd been appointed deputy, and he had the loyalty of someone who respects a person, not because of what they have, but because of what they've refused to trade away. He shook Corbett's hand after the justice of the peace was done. He tipped his hat to Ilara. "Congratulations, Mrs. Shaw," he said. Ruth saw Ilara pause just slightly at the name, not resistance, something more complicated than that. The sound of a thing becoming real. That evening, after Greer had driven back to town and Baird had ridden away down the road, Ruth made supper and then found something important to do in the kitchen for a long time. She heard the front door and then the sound of 2 people on the porch. She kept her back to the yard. She stood at her counter and listened to the wind outside, which had come up since afternoon and was working at the corner of the house the way it always did this time of year. She thought about the empty nails on the bedroom wall. She thought about the fact that she had watched Corbett Shaw rebuild this ranch from a half-broke operation after his father died and survive the departure of a woman who had not thought he was enough, and bury his brother in frozen ground in December. And she had watched him do all of it without asking anyone for anything he didn't think he'd already earned. She thought about Ilara Voss lifting a heavy bag down the steps at the depot, so an old woman wouldn't have to struggle. Small things were how you knew. Ruth had learned that. The large things, declarations, gestures, public demonstrations, those could be performed. Small things done when no one was supposed to be watching were the ones that told the truth. Outside on the porch, someone was talking. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the voices low, even 2 distinct registers without the edge that marks a conversation conducted at arm's length. She finished the dishes. She went to bed. At her window in the dark, looking out at the yard, she could see the faint glow of the porch lamp still lit. 2 shapes sitting apart, but not far apart in the cold Wyoming night. that smelled of the winter finally beginning to release its grip on things. She watched for a moment. Then she let the curtain fall. The empty nails, she thought, could wait a little longer, but not forever. She didn't hear what was said on that porch. She found out later in pieces, and she put it together the way you put things together when you've known people long enough to read what they leave out. What she eventually understood was this. Corbett Shaw had looked out at the dark land that was almost not his anymore and said the thing that cost him something to say. Not the words about the contract and the debt, because those were just facts, but the words after. I'm short $6,000 in 4 months. I don't know how to fix that. And Alara Voss, who had spent 3 weeks reading Owen Shaw's contract in the quiet of the sitting room after supper, had said I may have found something. And she had gone inside and come back with the contract and turned to page 3 and pointed to clause 7. He had read it. He had read it again. He had looked at her in the lamplight. This woman from St. Louis, who had set type for legal notices since she was 9 years old. This woman who had arrived at his ranch with one bag and gray eyes and not much more. And he had said, "What are you seeing?" And she had told him. And for the first time in a very long time, Corbett Shaw had felt the specific relief of not being alone with a problem he didn't know how to solve. He didn't say that. He was not a man who said things like that. But Ruth Pickett, who had known him for 14 years, understood it when she saw his face the next morning, something slightly loosened in it. A fraction less of the careful management that had been there since December. She didn't comment. She poured his coffee and went about her business. But she noticed. She always noticed. Clause 7 of Owen Shaw's loan contract with Creed National Bank read in its entirety as follows. In the event of the borrower's death prior to satisfaction of the principal obligation, disposition of collateral property shall proceed according to the inheritance statutes of Wyoming Territory, as established 1869, including but not limited to the rights of surviving spouse or lawful issue of the deceased's lineal heirs. It was boilerplate. That was the point. Creed's bank used the same contract form for every loan it issued. The same language, the same clause numbering the same language about surviving spouses that had been written into the form, because some lawyer in Cheyenne had copied it from an older form, and no one had thought to change it since. The clause assumed a certain kind of borrower, a married man, or a man with children, because most borrowers were. Owen Shaw had been neither, but the clause didn't know that. The clause didn't care. The clause said what it said. What it said, if you read it carefully enough, was that the rights of a lawful heir's surviving spouse were protected under the terms of disposition. Corbett Shaw was Owen's lawful heir. Corbett Shaw now had a surviving spouse. Alara had laid it out for him at the kitchen table the morning after the wedding, with the contract spread between them and her handwriting in the margins, small, precise. The handwriting of someone trained to fit a great deal of information into a small space. She had walked him through it, the way you walk someone through terrain you've already scouted, pointing out the landmarks, the places where the ground changed. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Creed's lawyer will say it doesn't apply, he said finally. that the clause was written for the borrower's spouse, not the heirs. Yes, she said. He'll say that. And he'll be arguing about the spirit of the language. That's a harder argument than arguing about what the language actually says. What it actually says is broad enough to hold us. She paused. If we have someone who knows how to make the argument. That was how the name Edmund Farr came into the conversation. Nolan Baird told Corbett about Farr on a Tuesday in the back office of the sheriff's department, while the sheriff himself was out on a call that Baird had maneuvered him toward, with the quiet competence of a young man who had learned how to create privacy without appearing to seek it. He's in Laramie, Baird said. Stepped away from the circuit court 4 years ago when his hands started giving him trouble. Doesn't take cases regularly anymore, but he takes certain cases, the ones he thinks are worth taking. He leaned back in his chair. He beat Creed in '79. Land dispute up near the Wyoming-Colorado line. Creed had a contract that looked airtight, and Farr found the seam in it. I don't know the details, but I know Creed hasn't forgotten it. Will he take this? He'll take it if he thinks he can win. He doesn't care about money anymore. He cares about winning. Baird paused. But he won't talk to you about it, Corbett. He'll want to talk to whoever read that contract. Corbett looked at him. He'll want to talk to your wife, Baird said. The drive to Laramie took most of a day in good conditions, and these were not good conditions. The road was still carrying the memory of winter in its ruts, and the horses worked hard on the upgrades. They left before first light and arrived in the early evening with the sun going flat and orange over the Laramie Range to the west. Edmund Farr lived in a 2-story frame house on the eastern edge of town. The kind of house that had been well built and was now well maintained in the way of old men who have nothing left to prove through renovation. His housekeeper showed them into a study that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco and a winter's worth of accumulated thought. Farr himself was 67, white-haired, with a face that had settled into an arrangement of deep lines that all pointed in the same direction toward his eyes, which were dark and alert in a way that made the rest of his age irrelevant. His hands rested on the arms of his chair. With a slight tremor that was the only concession his body seemed to be making to the years. He looked at them both when they came in. Then he looked at Alara. You're the one who read the contract, he said. Yes, she said. Sit down, he said. Talk to me. For 20 minutes, Alara talked. She didn't perform it. She didn't frame it or introduce it or build to it. She simply walked through the contract's language the same way she'd walked Corbett through it at the kitchen table systematically, with precision, with the confidence of someone who has already done the work of doubt and come out the other side of it. Farr listened without interrupting. His eyes moved between Alara's face and the contract pages he held in his trembling hands. When she finished, the room was quiet. You set type, Farr said. From the time I was 9. Legal notices, property transfers, court filings, contract disputes, death notices, whatever came through the shop. Farr set the contract down on his desk. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite what Ruth would have called approval. It was more measuring than that, more specific. The look of a man confirming a thing he'd already half decided. The argument is defensible, he said. It's not airtight. Creed's lawyer will push on the spirit versus letter distinction, and he'll push hard. But the language as written supports your reading, and I've seen worse cases made to stick in Wyoming courts." He paused. "Your problem is no longer the contract. Creed will attack the marriage," Corbett said. "He already is," Farr said. "I have a friend in the county clerk's office. Creed's lawyer filed a preliminary inquiry about your marriage 3 days ago. He's building an argument that it was arranged specifically to exploit the contract clause. He'll call it fraudulent." He looked at them both. "He's not wrong about the timing. He's wrong about the motive, but he's not wrong about the timing. And in a courtroom, the difference between those two things is not always as clear as it ought to be." The room held the information. "What do we need?" Elara asked. Farr looked at her. "I need to believe the marriage is real before I can argue that it is. I've been wrong about people before. I don't enjoy it." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you something, Mrs. Shaw, and I want you to answer it honestly, rather than correctly." Elara waited. "When your husband said you could win this, did you believe him?" She was still for a moment, not reluctant, thinking. The difference was visible if you knew to look for it. "I believe we can make the argument," she said finally. "I believe the argument is sound. Whether we win—" She stopped, started again. "I believe in what we're doing. I'm still learning to believe in everything else." Farr studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Corbett, who had been watching his wife say this with an expression that Ruth Pickett, had she been present, would have filed away carefully for later. "All right," Farr said. "I'll take the case." They did not make it back before dark. The road conditions that had slowed them coming in slowed them going out, and by the time they were an hour outside Laramie, the temperature had dropped, and the sky was doing what Wyoming skies did in March when you weren't paying close enough attention, moving from clear to something else without adequate warning. There was a way station off the main road, a small operation that kept 2 rooms for travelers and a stable for horses. They stopped there. There was 1 room available. They were adults. They managed. Corbett took the chair by the window. Elara took the bed. The lamp burned low between them, and the wind found every gap in the building's construction, which were numerous and made itself known through all of them. Outside, the horses were settled in the stable. Inside, the stillness of 2 people in a small space, each carefully not imposing on the other's portion of it. After a while, the lamp needed trimming. Elara got up and did it. She moved in the low light with the economy of someone accustomed to managing in close quarters, making no more movement than the task required. She sat back on the bed and pulled a blanket around her shoulders and looked at the trimmed flame. She spoke to the flame rather than to him, which made it easier. "My father's name was Georg Voss. He came from Stuttgart when he was 22. He started a print shop in St. Louis with $200 and a press he'd bought second-hand from a man going out of business in Ohio." She paused. "He never made much money, but he made a good paper. The kind of paper that printed what was true even when what was true was inconvenient for someone." Another pause. "That's actually what killed the paper in the end. He printed something about a city alderman that was entirely accurate, and the alderman had friends." Corbett said nothing. He understood this was not a conversation yet. It was something being placed in the room offered, not exchanged. "He died 2 years ago," she said. "The debts didn't die with him." Aldous Finch had been his primary creditor for the last 5 years. When my father was gone, Finch came to me with his accounting. She was quiet for a moment. He was very polite about it. He always was. He had very specific ideas about what form the settlement might take, and he was very polite about those, too. The wind pressed against the building. I left before he could formalize the arrangement, she said. I took what I could carry, and I put my name on the first list I found. Corbett Shaw, he said. She turned from the flame and looked at him in the low light. Corbett Shaw. She held his eyes. I should tell you I didn't know anything about you when I signed that paper. You were a name in a county and a distance I could manage. I know, he said. I'm telling you because Creed will use it. He already has the name. He'll have the story soon if he doesn't already. And when he puts it in front of a judge, he'll make it sound like I came here to get what I could get and leave when it suited me. That's not what you did. I know that. But I need you to know I know it. He was quiet. Outside, something shifted in the wind, a change in pitch that meant the temperature was still dropping. When you came in on the train, he said, you helped an old woman with her bag. Elara looked at him. Nobody sees that kind of thing in a person in one moment and then misreads them completely, he said. It takes a while to be sure, but it doesn't take forever. She looked at him for a long moment in the low lamplight. Then she said, Corbett. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. Shaw that had been preceding it for 3 weeks. He registered it. She saw that he registered it. Thank you, she said, for being straight with me from the start. I learned it the hard way, he said. Didn't take me twice. They sat in the room with the low lamp between them and the cold outside doing its work on the walls. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was something more useful than comfortable. It was honest. 2 people in a small space no longer arranging the distance between them with quite as much deliberate care. He was in the chair. She was on the bed. That was how they stayed until morning. But the room felt different at first light than it had at dark. And both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things that are understood don't need to be spoken, and are in fact better for not being. The 6 weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't announce themselves as significant while they're happening. They presented themselves as ordinary. They were weeks of work and meals and the kind of small, repeated contact that accumulates between people who live in close proximity and are paying attention. Silas Morrow watched all of it. He watched Elara learn to read the land, not its operations, which she was picking up faster than he'd expected, but its temperament. The way the north pasture drained after a thaw, which fence sections the cattle tested first when they were restless, the hour of day when the light changed on the ridge, and what that change meant for the afternoon weather. She asked questions nobody had thought to ask, because everybody else already knew the answers and the questions were good ones. He watched Corbett Shaw begin to move differently in his own house. It was not a large change, and it was not a fast one. But Silas had watched this man for 11 years, and he knew what his ordinary patterns looked like. And some of those patterns were quietly shifting. The lamp in the sitting room stayed lit later. The careful blankness that Corbett had been maintaining on his face since December, the blankness of someone managing grief by refusing to let it have any expression, had begun not to lift exactly but to ease, as if some counterweight had been set against it. Silas did not find this reassuring, not yet. He found Ruth Pickett one morning while she was taking sheets off the line, and he helped her fold them because she was shorter than the line and having trouble, and while they worked, he said, "What do you think of her?" Ruth took her corner of a sheet without looking at him. "Why do you ask me?" "Because you know people." "You know people too, Silas. You just don't trust what you know." He was quiet for a moment, working his end of the fold. "She came here because she needed to leave somewhere else," he said. "That's not the same as coming here because she wanted to be here." "It's not," Ruth agreed. "But people stay in places for different reasons than they arrive. And if she decides to leave," Ruth looked at him then, "you're not worried about her leaving. You're worried about what it does to him if she does." Silas said nothing. "I know," Ruth said. "I worry about it too." She took the folded sheet from him. "But worrying about it doesn't change what I see when I look at that woman. And what I see is someone who stayed when she could have found a reason not to." On a Thursday afternoon in the fourth week, Corbett rode into town and went to Nolan Baird's office. Not about the case. Baird was at his desk when Corbett came in and shut the door, and he looked up with the expression of a man who has learned to read visits by the way people close doors behind them. "I need something," Corbett said. He placed a folded piece of paper on the desk. Baird unfolded it. "Read it." Read it again. "Aldous Finch," he said. "He's in St. Louis. The address is on that paper. He has a claim on someone who left owing him money or what he calls money. I want to know if he's made inquiries into where she went. And if he has, I want to know before she does." Baird looked at him. "Does she know you're doing this?" "No." "Are you going to tell her?" Corbett picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it. "If nothing comes of it, there's nothing to tell." Baird folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer. He looked at Corbett for a moment with the expression of a young man who has decided not to say the thing he's thinking. "I'll make some inquiries," he said. Corbett nodded and left. The letter from Creed's lawyer arrived on a Friday, and it arrived in the form of a court filing, not a letter at all, which was its own statement about intent. Corbett read it at the kitchen table. Then he set it on the table, and Alara read it. The filing argued four things: that the marriage between Corbett Shaw and Alara Voss had been arranged after Corbett Shaw became aware of the terms of the Creed National Bank loan agreement, that the timing, 21 days between arrival and marriage, demonstrated intent to construct a legal instrument rather than form a genuine union, that Alara Voss had arrived in Wyoming from St. Louis under circumstances that suggested financial motivation, and that the court should issue a preliminary finding that the marriage could not form the basis of any claim against the loan's collateral provisions. Alara set it down. She looked at the kitchen wall for a moment, not at anything in particular, just the middle distance that people look at when they're deciding how to feel about a thing. "He's not wrong about the circumstances," she said. "He's wrong about what the circumstances mean." Corbett. She turned to look at him. "He got Finch's records. Look at point 3. She tapped the page. "He knows about the debt in St. Louis. He knows I left owing money. He's going to argue I came here to hide from one problem by creating a solution to a different one. And the timing makes it look like the timing is what it is," he said. "It doesn't change what's happened since." She looked at him. He can argue what he wants about why you came, Corbett said. He cannot argue about what you did after. And what you did after is read a contract that I'd been staring at for 2 months and find the one thing in it that changes everything. He paused. That's not the behavior of a woman who's here to take what she can get. A judge might not see it that way. That's why we have FAR. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up again. It was always coming up. The Wyoming wind, it never fully stopped. You learn to hear things through it. He'll go after the marriage itself, she said. He'll try to get the court to declare it invalid, which means we'll have to... She stopped. Prove it's real, Corbett said. Yes. He was looking at the filing on the table. Then he looked up. Is it? He asked. It was not a simple question. It held inside it everything that had accumulated since a woman stepped off a train at Cheyenne Depot and helped an old woman with her bag without anyone watching. It held the evenings in the sitting room and the kitchen table, and the lamp burning low and the conversation in a way station room in the dark. Elara held his eyes for a long moment. Yes, she said. I think it is. I think it has been for a while. I'm not sure exactly when. He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information he'd been waiting for, without quite admitting he was waiting. Then we go to court, he said. Creed came to the ranch 2 days before the hearing, and this time he came alone without his associates, without the men whose coats announced him. He rode in on his gray horse on a Tuesday afternoon and found Corbett at the barn. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. She watched Elara stop what she was doing at the desk in the sitting room and come to stand near Ruth without being called. In the yard, the two men talked. Creed did most of it. He was a man who used conversation as a means of exerting pressure, who placed his words with the care of someone laying hands on a person's shoulders to see how much they'd give. Corbett listened with his arms crossed and his weight settled back on his heels, which was what he did when he was very still on purpose. At one point, Creed made a gesture toward the house. Whatever he said, Corbett's response was brief, and the effect was immediate. Creed's posture changed slightly, a recalibration so small a person wouldn't have noticed it if they weren't looking. Creed rode away 15 minutes later. Corbett came inside. He went to the water pump and washed his hands with methodical attention, which was what he did when he was deciding what to say. He offered to settle, he said. 40 cents on the dollar, paid over 3 years, and he drops the challenge to the marriage. Elara said nothing. He wants this over before it gets too far, Corbett said. He's worried about something. He should be, Elara said. FAR will ask to see his other contracts. If his bank has been using this same form for 10 years, there are other cases where this clause could be argued. He's not just protecting this loan. He's protecting his entire system. Corbett looked at her. You figured that out, he said. It was not a question. Last week, she said. I didn't want to say it until I was sure it mattered. Now I'm sure. Why does it matter for us? Because it means he'd rather we walk away quietly with something than press forward and set a precedent. It means we have more ground than I thought. She paused. We should tell FAR before the hearing. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one that arrived when she'd said something that reorganized the way he understood a situation. Not, "I didn't think of that." Something more considered than that. "I'm reconsidering what I know." "I'll send word tonight," he said. He went to the desk. She went back to hers. Ruth returned to the kitchen. She hummed something under her breath that she couldn't have named a scrap of something her mother had sung. It meant nothing in particular. It was just the thing her voice did when she felt without being able to say exactly why that something had rounded a corner. The night before the hearing, Corbett did not sleep well. Ruth heard him up before 3 in the morning, moving through the house with the careful quiet of a man trying not to wake anyone, which told her he was not doing well with his own company. She did not get up. Elara did. Ruth heard the soft sounds of the kitchen. The stove being stoked, the kettle filled. 2 voices low, not the low of people trying to be private, just the natural register of nighttime conversation. She could not hear what was said. She listened to the shape of it instead, the rhythm and pause of it, the way one voice and the other voice alternated with the ease of people who have found the frequency at which they can talk to each other without having to search for it. She listened to it for a while. Then she let it become background. She slept. In the morning, Corbett came to breakfast with the look of a man who had not slept enough, but was no longer carrying the night's weight alone, which was different from rested, but was in its own way better. He ate his eggs. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table and then at Elara, and then at the window where the morning was coming up clear and cold over the ridge. "Ready," Elara said. "Yes," he said. They were. The courthouse in Cheyenne was a brick building on Capitol Avenue that smelled of wood polish and damp wool, and the density of air that accumulates in rooms where consequential things are regularly decided. Judge Clement Dowd held his court on the 2nd floor, in a room with tall windows that let in a gray March light and a view of the street below, where if you were sitting in the gallery and your attention wandered, you could watch ordinary life proceeding at its ordinary pace, entirely indifferent to what was being adjudicated above it. Corbett and Elara arrived early. Farr was already there, seated at the respondent's table with a leather case open before him, and his trembling hands moving through documents with a steadiness that his hands did not otherwise possess, as if the work itself stilled them. He looked up when they came in, looked at both of them with his dark, alert eyes, and said nothing beyond a nod. Creed's lawyer was a man named Phelps, younger than Farr by 30 years, with the smooth assurance of someone who had won enough cases in this county to know the furniture of the room by heart. He sat at the opposing table with 3 associates and a stack of documents bound in blue paper, and did not look up when Corbett and Elara entered. The gallery held a dozen people. Ruth Pickett was in the 3rd row. She had not been asked to come. She had come anyway. Baird stood near the back wall in his deputy's coat, arms folded, watching. Judge Dowd took his seat at 9 o'clock precisely. He was 64, with a broad face and a careful manner. A man who had presided over this county's disputes long enough to have developed a genuine allergy to theater. He arranged his papers, put on his reading glasses, and looked at the room over them with the expression of a man who has seen most things and expects today to show him something close to what he's already seen. "This is a preliminary hearing," He said on the question of whether the marriage of Corbett Shaw and Elara Voss Shaw constitutes a valid legal union for the purposes of the inheritance claim before this court. We are not adjudicating the underlying loan contract today. We are establishing whether the respondents have legal standing to challenge the foreclosure provisions. He looked at both tables. Mr. Phelps. Phelps was good. Ruth had expected that, and he was. He moved through his argument with a fluency that suggested he had rehearsed it, until the rehearsal disappeared. He sounded at each moment like a man arriving at his conclusions in real time, guided there by pure reason. The timing, the contract, the mail order arrangement, the circumstances in St. Louis. He placed the Finch documents before the court, a summary of the debt, a record of Elara's departure, a notarized statement from Finch himself, posted from St. Louis, attesting to the outstanding balance and to the abruptness with which she had left. He described with measured sympathy the situation of a woman in difficult circumstances, making a calculated decision to exploit a legal opportunity. He used the word leverage once. Then, apparently deciding it was useful, he used it 3 more times. He was nearly done when Farr rose. "Your Honor," Farr said. His voice was dry and unhurried and carried the room without effort, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "My colleague has presented the court with an interpretation of events. I'd like to present the court with the events themselves." Dowd looked at him over his glasses. "Mr. Farr." "I have 2 witnesses," Farr said. "I'd like to call the first." Phelps looked up. He had not expected 2 witnesses. "Mrs. Shaw," Farr said. Elara walked to the chair beside the judge's bench and sat down without ceremony. She was wearing her good wool coat, the one worn at the elbows, and her hair was pinned back the same way it had been at the depot in Cheyenne, the day she stepped off a train with one bag and helped an old woman down the steps. Without knowing anyone was watching, Ruth watched her settle into the chair with the stillness of someone who has decided in advance exactly how much of themselves they are willing to give to the room, and has made peace with that decision. Farr moved through the foundational questions with dispatch. Her background, her father's print shop, her experience with legal documents. He let her describe the contract in her own language, which was precise and unglamorous and considerably harder to argue with than a lawyer's paraphrase would have been. He let her explain Clause 7 in the plain terms of someone who had spent years setting type for exactly that kind of language, who understood it not as interpretation, but as craft. Then he stepped back. Phelps came forward. He was careful, and he was smart, and he understood Ruth could see him. Understand it, the slight adjustment in his approach, that this witness was not going to be rattled by volume or by implication. He came at her from the side. The timeline, the Finch debt, the mail order arrangement. He built toward his point the way a man builds a fence post by post, and the point he was building toward was this: that every decision she had made since her father died had been in some measure a calculation about her own survival, and that this marriage was no different. He was not wrong exactly. Ruth knew that. The precision of his wrongness was what made it dangerous. He arrived at his final question. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, "if this court rules in your favor today, If the marriage is found valid and the land is returned to the Shaw estate, do you intend to remain in Wyoming?" The room was quiet. Alara held Phelps's eyes. She did not look at Corbett. She did not look at Ruth. She answered the question that had been asked of her, and she answered it as if it were the simplest question in the room. "I'm not staying because of what this court decides," she said. "I'm staying because Wyoming is where I live. The ranch is where I live. That's not a legal position. It's just true." Phelps waited a moment. "But you came to Wyoming because—" "I came to Wyoming because I needed to go somewhere," she said. "That is also true. Both things are true, and I don't think the second one undoes the first." She paused. "A great many people came to this territory because they needed to go somewhere. I don't believe that disqualifies them from staying." The room held what she'd said. Dowd wrote something on his paper. Phelps thanked her and sat down. Farr waited until she had returned to her seat. Then he stood again. "Your Honor," he said, "my second witness." The name, when Farr spoke it, produced a reaction Ruth had not entirely anticipated. She had known Farr intended to call Silas Baird had told her 2 days ago quietly in the kitchen when Corbett was in the barn. She had kept it to herself, but she had not quite anticipated the quality of the silence that followed the name in that room. The way it registered on Corbett's face, not as betrayal, but as something more complicated. The expression of a man seeing a thing he hadn't arranged arrive in a place he hadn't expected it, and not knowing yet whether to be grateful or disturbed. Silas Morrow walked to the witness chair as he walked most places, without urgency, without performance. He sat down and looked at Farr, and then at the judge, and then at no one in particular, which was his habitual gaze, and it always reminded Ruth of the way certain animals hold very still, not because they are frightened, but because they are paying complete attention. Farr stood before him. "Mr. Morrow," he said, "you've worked the Shaw Ranch for how long?" 11 years. "And you've been present on the property for the duration of Mr. and Mrs. Shaw's marriage?" "I have." "In that time, have you observed the two of them together?" "Every day," Silas said. "Tell the court what you've observed." Silas was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, collecting himself, finding the right place to begin. "I've watched Corbett Shaw learn to set a coffee cup down quieter than he used to," he said, "because she reads in the evenings and the sound bothered her. He didn't tell her he'd noticed. He just changed." He paused. "I've watched her stand at the fence line in the cold for 20 minutes because he was working out there alone and she didn't think he ought to be." Another pause. She didn't say anything to him. She just stood there until he was done. The room was very quiet. "I spent 3 months trying to find reasons to doubt her," Silas said. "I had reasons, good ones. She came here fast. She came here because she needed to. She didn't know anything about ranching or Wyoming or the Shaws." He looked at the judge. "But I watched every day. And what I watched was two people who were being careful with each other, in the way that people are careful when the thing between them matters to them, not when they're performing something, when they're protecting something." He stopped. "I know the difference. I've seen both." Dowd looked at him for a moment. "You've known Mr. Shaw a long time, Mr. Morrow." "Yes, Your Honor." Would you say you're a partial witness? Silas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I came in partial against her, he said. I came around because of what I saw. Make of that what you will. Dowd wrote something. He looked at Phelps. Phelps had no questions for Silas Morrow. Dowd took 30 minutes. He went to his chambers, and the room held itself in the suspension of courthouse waiting, not quite silence, not quite noise. The sound of people breathing and shifting and pretending to be more composed than they were. Ruth sat in the third row and watched Corbett at the respondents' table. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the wood grain of the table in front of him with the focused attention of a man who has put everything he has into a thing and is now required to wait. Elara sat beside him. After a while, without looking up, she placed her hand on the table between them. Just placed it there. Open, not reaching. He looked at it. Then he placed his hand over hers. Ruth looked away. Not because it wasn't meant to be seen, but because some things are diminished by being witnessed to directly. Some things need the privacy of a half-turned eye to remain what they are. Dowd returned at 10 minutes past 11. He settled his papers. He looked at both tables. The court finds, he said, insufficient grounds to declare the marriage of Corbett Shaw and Elara Voss Shaw invalid for purposes of this proceeding. The union was legally contracted, properly witnessed, and recorded in accordance with territorial law. The question of motive in forming a legal union is not under Wyoming territorial statute sufficient basis for nullification, absent evidence of fraud in the ceremony itself which has not been demonstrated. He paused. The respondents, therefore, have standing to contest the foreclosure provisions of the Owen Shaw loan agreement on the grounds articulated by Mr. Farr. That matter will be scheduled for full hearing. He looked over his glasses at Phelps. Mr. Phelps, I'd like your client to know that I'll be reading the entire contract form at that hearing, not just the contested clause. Phelps said nothing. We're adjourned, Dowd said. Outside the courthouse, the day had warmed slightly, the way March days sometimes do in Wyoming, a false warmth here for an hour, and then gone but real while it lasted. The light was cleaner than it had been in the morning, and the street below was going about its business. Farr came out behind them and shook Corbett's hand, and then Elara's. His hands were trembling, but his grip was firm. The full hearing is in 8 weeks, he said. We have work to do, but we're standing on ground now. He looked at Elara. The argument you built held up. It'll hold up again. He went back inside because Farr was not a man who prolonged his departures. Baird came down the steps and stopped in front of Corbett. Before you hear it elsewhere, Baird said. He paused. Finch sent 2 letters, one in February, one in March, inquiring after a woman from St. Louis who might have come through the territory. He looked at Corbett steadily. I held them. They never arrived. Corbett said nothing. Elara was still for a moment. Then she turned to look at Corbett. He met her eyes. He didn't explain it. There was nothing in his face that asked for anything in return. No debt being called, no expectation of gratitude. Just the look of a man who had done a thing he thought needed doing and was not ashamed of having done it quietly. When? She asked. 4 weeks ago, he said. She held his eyes for a long moment. The street moved around them. Horses, a wagon, 2 men in conversation on the far sidewalk. Wyoming going about its business. You didn't tell me, she said. There was nothing to tell until there was. She was quiet. Then she said, "That's a very particular kind of thing to do for a person." I thought it needed doing. Baird put his hat on and excused himself with the tact of a man who understands which conversations he is not part of. They stood on the courthouse steps a moment longer in the false warmth of the March afternoon. Then they walked to where the horses were tied and rode home. That night, Corbett handed the reins to Silas without a word and walked north. Silas watched him go but didn't ask. Ruth, coming to the barn door to see about the horses, watched too. She saw where he was headed. The old property line, the one his father had staked with flat sandstone rocks set at intervals through the grass. And she turned back inside and let him go. He walked to where the two pieces of land met, where his father's stones gave way to Owen's newer fence posts, and he stood there in the dark. The temperature had dropped again, as it always did once the false warmth of the afternoon burned off. The stars were sharp and numerous. The ridge to the west was a dark shape against a darker sky. He stood for a long time. There was no thought he was working through that could be articulated. It was not that kind of standing. It was the kind you do when something has shifted, and you are waiting for your internal geography to catch up to the new arrangement. He had been braced against a particular outcome for so long that the release of the bracing itself was something he needed to find a place for. He was thinking about his father who had set these stones. He was thinking about Owen buried in the northeast corner with a simple granite marker and 15 years of work in the land around him. He was thinking about what it meant to keep a thing and what it cost and whether the cost was different when you didn't carry it alone. After a while, he walked back. In the kitchen, Ruth was finishing the last of the dinner dishes. She heard him come in and registered his footsteps, the pattern of a man who has been walking in open country and is still carrying the rhythm of it. She heard him stop. She heard Elara's voice from the sitting room. She heard him go that direction. Ruth dried her hands. She went to her room, which was off the back of the house, and she did not try to hear what was being said, because it was not meant for her. And she was old enough to know that. But she lay in the dark for a while, aware of the house around her. The sounds of it, the creaking of the sitting room floorboards. She knew as well as her own breathing. The lamp stayed lit for a long time. 3 weeks later, Creed's lawyer sent a letter. Not a court filing a letter, which was a different thing. It came addressed to Edmund Farr, and Farr sent a summary to Corbett. Creed was proposing to settle. The terms, the remaining balance on Owen's loan to be restructured over 5 years at a reduced rate. The foreclosure provisions waived. The challenge to the marriage withdrawn. In exchange, the Shaws would agree not to introduce the contract form or its other applications into any future legal proceedings. Elara read Farr's summary at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and said, "He's protecting the other contracts." "That's what I thought," Corbett said. "If we go to the full hearing and Farr argues the clause and Dowd decides in our favor, there are at least a dozen other loans that could be challenged the same way. People who didn't have someone to read the fine print." She looked at the letter. "He'd rather lose this quietly than lose everything loudly. Do we take it?" She thought for a moment. Not long she had been thinking about it since the moment she understood that Creed's retreat from the hearing had a shape to it. "We take it," she said, "with one addition. I want FAR to notify the 3 most recent borrowers under this contract form that the clause exists and what it means. Creed can't stop that. It's not part of any proceeding. It's just information." Corbett looked at her. "He hurt people with this contract," she said. "Not just Owen. I want at least some of them to know they might have options." She paused. "We don't have to fight all of it, but we don't have to let all of it stand either." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the March wind found a new angle on the eaves and tested it. "I'll write to FAR today," he said. He did. FAR replied that he would be pleased to make those notifications, and that he had in fact already drafted the letters and was waiting to be asked. The settlement was signed on a Thursday. Creed did not come in person. He sent his lawyer, who shook no one's hand, and left as quickly as a man could leave, while maintaining the appearance of dignity. Owen Shaw's land, 2,400 acres, including the northeast corner where the family stones were stayed with the Shaws. On the Sunday following, Corbett took Alara to the cemetery. They rode out in the morning when the light was still low and the air carried that quality of early spring, not warm yet not fully, but no longer committed to cold. The northeast pasture was beginning to show green at the base of the grass, the tentative color of a thing deciding to come back. The cemetery was small, 4 stones in all, counting Owen's new one, Corbett's father. His mother gone when he was 15. An uncle he'd mentioned once and not explained further. And Owen, the granite, darker than the others because it was newer, the edges not yet softened by weather. Corbett stood at Owen's stone for a while. He didn't speak, and Alara didn't press him. She stood beside him at the right distance, close enough that he was not alone there, far enough that she was not crowding something that belonged to him. After a while, he said, he would have found the whole thing funny. The contract, the hearing, all of it. Owen had a particular sense of humor about his own mistakes. He could see them clearly after the fact. He just couldn't always see them coming. "That's a generous way to remember someone," Alara said. "It's an accurate one," he said. He was the kind of person who made expensive mistakes and never made the same one twice. I used to find that infuriating. He paused. Now I think it was something like courage, actually. Most people stop trying things after the first expensive mistake. Alara looked at Owen's stone. "He tried to build something," she said. "He did. And it survived him." Corbett looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the land, at the pasture beginning to green at the fence line that Owen had put in with his own labor, and his own borrowed money and his own courage about expensive mistakes. Looking at the thing that had survived. "Yes," Corbett said. "It did." They stood there a while longer. Then they rode back. That evening, Ruth and Silas sat on the back steps while the dinner things settled, and the day moved toward dark. It was a thing they did sometimes without planning it. The end of a long day, finding them both in the same place with nothing particular to say and no objection to the quiet. "Cold's letting up," Silas said. "Probably one more hard week," Ruth said. "March doesn't give up clean." "No." He looked out at the pasture. "I'll need another man for the spring work." "You'll have to ask him." "I know." "Are you going to Tomorrow, maybe. He picked up a small stone from the step beside him, turned it over in his hand, set it down. I'll stay through the summer at least. See how things settle. Ruth didn't answer. She knew this was the answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud. The question of whether he was staying, whether he'd decided what he thought about the way things had gone. He had decided. He was saying so in the only way Silas Morrow said anything which was sideways and practical, and without editorial. She was satisfied with that. They sat until it was full dark. Then they went inside. In the sitting room, the lamp was lit. From where Ruth passed through the hall, she could see them both. Corbett at his desk, Elara at hers, their backs at a slight angle to each other, in the way of people who are each working but aware at every moment of the other person in the room. Not looking at each other, not needing to. Ruth went to bed. She found the contract on her way through the kitchen in the morning. It was on the table folded, which was how she recognized it. She had seen it folded that same way a dozen times. The mail-order bride agreement signed by both of them on the first night. Witnessed by Greer, the justice of the peace, with Corbett's handwritten addition along the left margin. There was new writing at the bottom of the page, below all the printed clauses and all the signatures. Corbett's hand, large and even without flourish. This contract is no longer in effect. The arrangement it described has become something else, something that does not require a contract. If you are willing to stay on those terms, I am glad of it. If you need more time to be sure, take it. There is no deadline on this one. Below that in different ink. Smaller Elara's precise hand, the hand trained by years of fitting words into the space available. I don't need more time. Ruth stood in the kitchen and held the piece of paper for a moment. Then she folded it carefully back the way she'd found it and set it on the table. She started the stove. She put the kettle on. She began the ordinary work of a morning, and while she worked, she listened to the house around her, the sounds of it waking up the rhythms of people who have found in the same small set of rooms something they had not necessarily been looking for and had chosen to keep. She heard the back door and then Corbett's boots on the step, and then the sound of two people in the yard not talking, just present in the same space, moving through the same cold morning air. She kept her eyes on her work. She didn't need the window to know what was out there. Later, she would think about what she had watched these past months, and how little of it she could have described in terms that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't seen it. How it was never the large things. How it was Elara helping an old woman with a bag on a train platform, with no one watching. How it was Corbett driving a post-hole digger into frozen ground because he could not make himself go to the station and could not make himself stay home. How it was two people in a small room in Laramie talking through a lamp-lit night and arriving at the other side of it differently than they had gone in. How it was Silas Morrow, the most skeptical witness she knew, sitting in a courthouse chair and telling a judge I watched every day. And what I watched was two people being careful with each other, in the way that people are careful when the thing between them matters to them. That was what she had watched. All of it. She poured the water when the kettle was ready. She set out 3 cups because Silas would be in from the barn within the hour, and there was no reason not to be prepared. She stood at the counter and looked at the kitchen she had kept for 14 years. and thought about the nails on the bedroom wall. How there had been 3 empty ones when Elara arrived, and how she had passed that room last week and noticed without pausing that they were no longer empty. A map. A folded piece of paper she hadn't been close enough to read. A small dark ribbon that Ruth didn't know the story of and hadn't asked about because there were some stories that people kept until they were ready to give them. And it was not her business to hurry any of it. The nails were filled. The contract was superseded. The land was staying with the family it had been built for. Outside the window, the sky over the ridge was the clear, pale color of a morning that intended to be a good day. The false warmth of yesterday was gone as she'd known it would be, but the light had a different quality than it had for months. Something about the angle of it, the way it was beginning finally to come down, rather than just across the first hint that the year was remembering how to tilt back toward the sun. Corbett Shaw came through the back door, stamping mud from his boots. He nodded at the counter. He picked up his cup. A moment later, Elara came in behind him, pulling her coat off her hair, slightly disordered by the morning wind. She looked at the stove and then at Ruth. "Thank you," she said. "Sit down," Ruth said. "There's breakfast." They sat down. Silas came through the door a few minutes later and paused in the entrance for just a moment long enough to take in the table. The 4 cups, the particular unremarkable ease of the room, then took his place without ceremony. Ruth set the food out and poured the coffee and sat down herself, and they ate in the way that people eat when they have been up since before light, doing the work that needs doing without much talking, with the comfortable economy of people who do not need to perform their ease with each other, because the ease is actual. Ruth ate her eggs. She drank her coffee. She looked at the window which framed a piece of Wyoming morning that was, she thought, not a bad thing to look at. She knew what she knew. That was enough.